So in most cases of future societies, the stories come after the collapse of society as we know it. The shedding of our current methods of using fossil fuels and moving towards something else, well, that's always part of the story. Sometimes that change comes in a cohesive, non-bumpy way, but most stories tell of the collapse of our current society, followed by the time of change, which then leads to the formation of the newer utopian civilization. This change part gets glossed over. We were there. Something happened. Now we're here. Right? So Connie and I today are going to talk about that something happened part. All right? But before we get there, I want to talk for a moment just about the concept of separation. We live in a world where technology separates us from the so-called natural world. We go from separate protected spaces, our homes, to separate protected spaces, our cars, to separate protected spaces, a supermarket, an office, whatever it may be. Then when we are done being out in the world, we reverse it and do the same thing coming home. This phenomenon, which actually has a name, which is called car dependency, is something that I first encountered being described in Robert Pirsig's book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, one of my favorites. And he described that in this way. You see things vacationing on a motorcycle in a way that is completely different from any other. In a car, you're always in a compartment. And because you're used to it, you don't realize that through the car window, everything you see is just more TV. You're a passive observer, and it's all moving by you boringly in a frame. On a cycle, that frame is gone. You're completely in contact with it all. You're in the scene, not just watching it anymore, and the sense of presence is overwhelming. That concrete whizzing by 5 inches below your foot, yeah, that's the real thing. The same stuff you walk on, and it's right there, so blurred you can't focus on it. Yet you could put your foot down and touch it any time. And the whole thing, that whole experience, is never removed from immediate conscience. I'm a former motorcyclist, and I completely understand this passage. There's a beauty being present in the world even as you move through it. And there's nothing like a sudden rainstorm to remind you that you are truly a part of something and not separate from. Now, Connie and I are pagans. As such, we believe that humans are a part of the connected whole of life. We belong to nature. We are nature. And again, we live in a world where technology separates us from that fact. So what would it take for us to become truly interdependent again? I ask you this: what if we need to step back to step forward? Personally, I believe it's going to take a significant traumatic event that takes us backwards to allow us to divest ourselves of our reliance on our current technology, which is a system that has pulled us away from the natural world. And in so doing, hollow out the space we need in order to create the connections that would allow us to coalesce and move forward. The book we're going to talk about today is written by S.M. Stirling. It's part of a series of books known as the Emberverse series, or alternately, Novels of the Change. It begins with the book, Dies the Fire. This series is described as what happens after a mysterious and yet sudden worldwide event takes place that the characters simply call the change. The change alters both the course of history and all physical laws because it causes all electricity, firearms, explosives, internal combustion engines, steam power, and most forms of high energy density technology on Earth to permanently no longer function. Most of the action in the series takes place in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. There's no reason given for the change. In fact, the characters settle on alien space bats as the reason behind this. And yeah, it's a dark series, and if you know Connie and I, that kind of hits right. We're not really the fluffy and airy kind of people. It focuses on how our characters survive the sudden loss of 600 years of technological progress. There's pain, there is conflict, and there's death on a massive scale. There is also a morality play. The stories are a consistent discussion about sacrificing for the good of the whole. It's about who decides what gets sacrificed, how they decide, and when. You know, when undergoing trauma situations, there's always that triage element about how decisions get made. Choices need to be made with eyes wide open and understanding the grief and the sorrow that others are going through. And if we can do that, my opinion, this will lead in the end to hope. In the books, yes, it's hope as the characters learn to live, to adapt, and even to thrive in their new environment. So now that I've set the stage, I'm going to let Connie tell you about the book.
When the world turns upside down, you grope around in the dark for something you can hold on to, something you can trust. I think that if there were an attack on our electrical grid, I would hold on to some spare cash I have squirreled away, the land my husband and I own, and family connections. When something deeply embedded in our lives is gone, that changes the answer to the question, what is valuable? In Dies the Fire, when the entire infrastructure of society is instantly dismantled, then the answer is not money, and certainly not fancy cars or electronics, but instead food, skills, and strength. The currency people exchange among themselves changes from cash and checks to goods and food and labor, and perhaps most importantly, skills. Those old-timey practices that we keep as hobbies, the ones that connect us more deeply to the earth and satisfy our souls, end up being the most useful set of skills we could have collected. To hand sew clothes, or card wool, or weave cloth. To know how to defend yourself with stick and blade and strength. To grow and cook and preserve your own food. The community that has members with these skills is a rich and powerful society. And yes, I hear in those words what a doomsday prepper preaches. That we must prepare for political or economic crisis, which causes civil disorder. The thing is, they're not wrong. Those old-timey skills would be more precious than gold in a cataclysmic time. Another thing doomsday preppers get right, during such an upheaval, we could no longer remain separate the way Jeff described our lives at the beginning. To survive, we would need to band together with common purpose. In Dies the Fire, several different communities are explored, and this common purpose is different for each group. In each disparate community, people coalesce around a strong leader or group of leaders and take on the characteristics and values of the leaders. My favorite community, it should not surprise you to learn, is a coven of pagans that group together in a log cabin in a national forest. Their priestess, Juniper, is of genuine Scots ancestry, and so they play up the clan aspects and the wearing of plaids and tartans, as well as the divine intercession of Celtic deities, in order to foster deeper community. These people are good friends already, and they trust each other. It is very helpful that they were a loving group before the change happened. Eventually, most survivors in the area decide to join Juniper's clan Mackenzie, and even to become initiates into her coven. At one point, Junie says to some of her original coven members, "Do you two feel the truly bizarre irony of someone wanting to become a witch so that they can fit in?" It is funny if you've ever spent time in this subculture of misfits. There is a second group, the Bear Killers, who joined together around a single, very capable man with military training, impressive wilderness skills, and a knack for leadership. Where Clan Mackenzie makes decisions by consensus, the Bear Killers have their leader in Mike, who chooses his advisors carefully and well. Typically, he makes the decisions, but also believes in policy governance, as it were. A very different group is formed under a different, very capable man. But this one has made a study of feudalism, is SCA trained to sword and stave, and is power-hungry and lacking in all compassion. His society gets the trains running on time, as it were, but he is ruthless, throwing hungry people out of his society if they do not have the skills or materials he wants. Realizing that there are now only two kinds of people, farmers and those who run the farmers. He does not want to be a farmer. He becomes a despot, ruling with absolute power, and he has a vicious streak of which he makes effective use to control the populace. The last community I will mention is the committee of the university, who continue to make progress as they always have, by committee, by consensus, with painful slowness. The pros and cons of this approach should be clear to those of us in this university town. That is, everyone gets heard and everyone has a voice and a vote and an axe to grind. They are the most egalitarian, possibly even more so than Clan Mackenzie, but they get the least work done. There's a painful analogy for us. Many years ago, I first became aware of a way of living called co-housing. It is essentially a planned neighborhood where the inhabitants agree on a set of rules, how to share the work, and when they will sit down to meals together, typically at least once a day. They take turns making the food, tending the community garden, taking care of the children, doing the necessary work of the community. And while everyone does have their own domicile, so not a commune, they do not consider themselves separate, but rather as parts of the whole. The advantages of this way of living, even without a cataclysmic disaster, are many. Where individuals in a normal neighborhood might buy each of them a lawnmower, in co-housing there is only need for one that is shared. There are built-in babysitters for the little ones. Elders and youngsters are here for the wisdom each offers and a sense of living with the earth instead of just on top of it. This kind of living is not for everyone. I remember describing this dream to a friend who listened attentively and then said, "There is not one thing in what you just said that I would want." I was taken aback. How could anyone not understand that this was the best way to live? In community, sharing work, sharing joy. But how to get from here to there? In Dies the Fire, there is an underlying theme that we are not all going to survive such a disaster. In fact, I believe the author posited that 99 out of 100 people would die. But for the 1/100th of the population, the need to pivot to a new way of living became really clear. This paragraph reveals the thoughts of Mike, leader of the Bear Killers. From what he'd seen, the vast majority of people were going to wait a while for things to return to normal, or for the Army or the National Guard to show up. Then, when they started to get hungry or the water didn't run anymore, probably a lot of them would panic and go looking for a place where things were normal. The idea that the whole planet had changed was simply too big to grasp, and accepting it meant looking death in the face, the death of a world. There's an interesting issue that comes up during the first days of the transition after the change. The government, what's left of it, begins to try to collect some share of the goods and food people have to redistribute it to folks in the city. But there is a problem with this equitable redistribution of goods. From Dies the Fire. No, Juniper Mackenzie added her voice to the chorus of 100 others, all the adults within walking distance of this spot. The foragers approaching from the west slowed uncertainly as they heard it, a few of them ringing the bells on their bicycles as if that would clear the road. There weren't many of them, 40 or 50 she estimated, but they all had some sort of weapon, and they had a bicycle-drawn cart behind. No, no, no. The face-off was taking place well away from her cabin, what they had taken to calling it the hall. There were so many people here, and they were so loud, but it seemed quiet and empty. No drone or roar of engines. You noticed more without that burr of background noise. The foragers stopped as a man walked forward waving a white flag on the end of a pole. He wore a police officer's uniform. A mousy-looking woman accompanied him with a clipboard in her hands. He carried a much more practical hunting crossbow. "Listen," he called when he'd come close. "We're here by order of Acting Governor Johnson to requisition a quota of supplies for emergency redistribution." And Junie in her head thinks this. Sweet goddess, gentle and strong, aid me now. Great Agma, Lord of eloquence, lend me your golden tongue to calm these troubled waters. "No," she said, and held up her bow to stop the chant when it threatened to start again. She continued into the ringing silence. "No, we will not give you our food. Not because we grudge help, but because we have little ones of our own to think of. If we gave you all that we have, you'd be starving again in a week, and so would we. Starving to death before the crops came in. You've already taken more than we can spare. If you want to do something for those poor city people, get them moving. Set them to work planting, find them seeds and tools. We'll help all we can. Don't keep them sitting until they die. Go back. There's nothing for you here. We don't want to hurt you, but we'll fight for our children and our homes if we must. Go. Get out." "Out!" Other voices took it up. "Out! Out! Out!" One by one, the foragers turned and mounted their bicycles and left. This is truly a difficult attitude to embrace when one is as empathetic and compassionate as are the members of Junie's clan. "If things are all messed up this way, folks will need to pull together," one of them says, a hint of disapproval in his voice. But then Junie herself rescues a wounded woman and her child, explaining, "All right, Sally, we can't help everyone, which doesn't mean we can't help anyone." And that's the point. We won't be able to help everyone, but that doesn't mean we can't help anyone. The way through will not be easy. It will be hard and dark, but there will also be joy. And if we do it well, a deeper connection with all that is. We need to put on our own oxygen masks before we can help anyone else. We will need to find ways to connect with others to create our own interdependent web, which will lead to a more thoughtful, more loving community. But we will also need to fight for ourselves and our ideals. And when that fight goes against us, we will regroup. And we will work, and we will fight, and we will sacrifice so that we can survive, so that our children can survive, so that their children get to have that better world that is imagined by so many utopias. Blessed be.